A man lies dying in a house in Essex, surrounded by the books and papers that consumed his life. It's October 1704, and John Locke, the philosopher who dared to suggest that kings were not chosen by God and that human minds began as blank slates, knows his time is ending. He's 72 years old, and he spent decades in exile, in hiding, in danger. His ideas have been banned, burned, and condemned. But they've also travelled farther than he ever did, shaping revolutions he'll never see and nations that don't yet exist. This is the story of how a sickly child from a Puritan household became the man who gave the world its most dangerous idea: that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. And if you think philosophy is abstract and disconnected from real life, consider this. The words Locke wrote in hiding would appear almost verbatim in the American Declaration of Independence. His theories about education would transform how we raise children. His thoughts about the human mind would create modern psychology. 3 centuries later, we're still living in the world John Locke built, but the man who constructed these revolutionary ideas was no firebrand. He was cautious, calculating, and terrified of persecution. He published his most radical work anonymously. He fled England in disguise. He denied writing the very books that made him famous. How does someone so careful produce ideas so explosive? How does a man who spent years studying medicine and never practicing it end up reshaping political philosophy? The answer lies in a life far stranger than the tidy image his admirers later created. Rington was the kind of English village where nothing ever happened. Tucked into the Somerset countryside, about 10 miles from Bristol, it was a place of thatched roofs and church bells, where the same families had farmed the same land for generations. The Civil War raging across England in 1632 felt distant here, an abstraction discussed in hushed tones, but not yet a physical reality. Into this quiet world, on August 29th, 1632, John Locke was born. His father, also named John, was a country lawyer and clerk to the local justices of the peace. The elder Locke wasn't wealthy, but he had something more valuable in 17th century England: connections. He owned a small amount of land, enough to provide modest income, and he'd cultivated relationships with powerful families in the area. His wife, Agnes Keene, came from a family of tanners and had brought a small dowry to the marriage. They'd already lost one child. This new son would be their only surviving boy. The house where John entered the world was unremarkable, a typical Somerset cottage with thick walls and small windows. But the timing of his birth would prove anything but ordinary. England was tearing itself apart. King Charles I, convinced of his divine right to rule, was clashing with Parliament over money, religion, and power. The tensions that had been building for years were about to explode into open warfare. Within months of John's birth, his father made a choice that would shape everything that followed. He joined the parliamentary army, the forces opposing the king. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Choosing sides in a civil war meant risking everything: your property, your freedom, your life. But the elder John Locke was a committed Puritan, and he believed Parliament's cause was righteous. He rode off to fight, leaving his young wife and infant son behind in Somerset. The boy who would one day argue that political authority derives from consent grew up in a household marked by his father's absence and the constant anxiety of war. His mother managed the household alone, stretched thin by worry and limited resources. Food was uncertain. News from the war was sporadic and often grim. The young John learned early that the world was dangerous and unstable, that authority figures fought each other with muskets and pikes, that choosing the wrong side could cost you everything. When his father returned from the war, he brought back no wealth or glory. The parliamentary cause had won, the king had been executed, but the rewards for common soldiers were meagre. The elder Locke resumed his work as a country attorney, his political idealism tempered by the harsh realities he'd witnessed. He was stricter now, more demanding. He'd seen what happened to men who lacked discipline. The relationship between father and son became the template for John Locke's later theories about education. The elder Locke was stern but not cruel, distant but not neglectful. He maintained a formal reserve with young John, believing that familiarity bred contempt. In his son's presence, he was always the authority figure, never the friend. Only as John grew older did his father gradually relax this severity, allowing a warmer relationship to develop. Young John was a sickly child, prone to respiratory ailments that would plague him throughout his life. He spent long hours indoors, reading when he could, observing the adults around him with the quiet intensity of someone who knows they're physically vulnerable. The Puritan household valued education, but books were expensive and carefully chosen. The Bible dominated, of course, but there were other texts too. Classical authors in translation, works of theology and moral instruction. What saved John from a life of provincial obscurity was his father's one valuable asset: his connection to Alexander Popham. Popham was a member of Parliament, a man of genuine power and influence. He'd fought in the war alongside the elder Locke, and he remembered his former comrade favourably. In 1647, when John was 14, Popham used his influence to secure the boy a place at Westminster School in London. This was an extraordinary opportunity. Westminster was one of England's great schools, training ground for the elite. Boys who attended Westminster went on to Oxford or Cambridge, then into positions of power in church and state. For a country lawyer's son from Somerset, it was a leap across social classes that would have been impossible without Popham's patronage. But the London young John arrived in was nothing like the sleepy village of his childhood. The city was massive, chaotic, filthy beyond anything he'd experienced. The streets ran with sewage, the air choked with coal smoke. Disease moved through the crowded neighbourhoods like a prowling animal, and everywhere there was noise. Vendors hawking their wares, wagons clattering over cobblestones, arguments and laughter, and the constant press of humanity. Westminster School sat in the shadow of Westminster Abbey, close enough to the centres of power that students could feel history happening around them. Parliament met nearby. The king, or what remained of royal authority in these strange years after Charles I's execution, maintained a presence. The boys at Westminster were being prepared to enter this world of power, and they knew it. The curriculum was brutal by modern standards. Students rose before dawn and spent their days drilling in Latin and Greek, memorizing vast passages of classical authors, composing verses in dead languages. Physical punishment was routine. Masters believed the rod was essential to learning, and they applied it freely. The food was poor, the living conditions harsh. Many boys fell sick. Some died. Locke survived, but he didn't thrive. He was a competent student, nothing more. His later writings suggest he found the endless rote memorization stultifying, the physical discipline excessive. He learned his Latin and Greek, but he also learned something else, that the educational methods everyone accepted as natural and necessary were actually choices, and perhaps poor ones. The seeds of his later revolutionary ideas about teaching children with kindness rather than violence were planted here, in a school where beating students was considered good pedagogy. Outside the school walls, England continued its convulsions. The execution of Charles I in 1649 had created a power vacuum. Oliver Cromwell, the military leader who'd commanded the parliamentary forces to victory, was gradually consolidating control. By the time Locke was a teenager, England had become something it had never been before, a republic, though they called it a commonwealth. There was no king, only a Lord Protector and a parliament stripped of its royalist members. The Puritan Revolution that Locke's father had fought for was reaching its zenith. Theatres were closed as immoral. Dancing was forbidden. Christmas celebrations were banned as papist superstition. The government tried to regulate private behaviour in ways that would have seemed absurd a generation earlier. It was an experiment in using state power to enforce religious morality, and it was making many people deeply uncomfortable. Young Locke absorbed all of this. He was living through one of the most dramatic political transformations in English history, watching as men debated whether kings were necessary, whether the church should control the state or the state the church, whether ordinary people had rights that governments must respect. These weren't abstract questions. They were matters of life and death, playing out in the streets around his school. In 1652, at age 19, Locke won election to a studentship at Christ Church, Oxford. This was the culmination of his Westminster education, the prize that made all those years of Latin conjugations worthwhile. Christ Church was Oxford's grandest college, home to the university's cathedral, training ground for bishops and statesmen. A studentship there was a position of genuine privilege, bringing with it income, lodging, and the opportunity to pursue studies indefinitely. Oxford should have been exciting. Instead, Locke found it disappointing. The university was still teaching medieval philosophy, endless debates about Aristotelian metaphysics that seemed disconnected from the revolutionary changes happening in natural philosophy across Europe. While men like Galileo and Descartes were reshaping humanity's understanding of the physical world, Oxford dons were still arguing about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. The prescribed course of study was logic, metaphysics, and classical languages. Students attended lectures, participated in formal disputations, and worked toward degrees in a system that hadn't changed substantially in centuries. It was intellectually stifling, and Locke knew it. He did the work required of him, but his real education was happening elsewhere. Because Oxford, for all its institutional conservatism, was also a place where curious minds could find each other. In the gaps between official studies, in private rooms and informal gatherings, students and junior faculty were discussing the new ideas filtering in from the continent. They were reading Descartes' Meditations, learning about the experimental method, questioning everything their professors took for granted. The scientific revolution was happening, and even Oxford couldn't completely seal itself off from it. Locke began spending time with a circle of students interested in natural philosophy. They conducted primitive experiments, debated the nature of matter and motion, tried to reconcile the new mechanical philosophy with Christian theology. It was amateur work, fumbling attempts by young men who lacked proper equipment and training. But it was alive in a way that their official studies were not. Then in 1658, something happened that would transform England again. Oliver Cromwell died. The Lord Protector who'd held the Commonwealth together through sheer force of will was gone, and his son Richard proved incapable of replacing him. Within 2 years, the Republic collapsed. The army generals who really held power began negotiating with the exiled son of Charles I. In 1660, Charles II returned to England and was proclaimed king. The experiment in republican government was over. The monarchy was restored, and with it came a wave of reaction against everything the Commonwealth had represented. The Puritans who'd ruled England for a decade suddenly found themselves out of favour, sometimes in danger. Men who'd supported Parliament during the Civil War had to tread carefully. This should have been a disaster for John Locke. His father had fought against Charles I. The family had supported the parliamentary cause, but Locke himself had been too young to take sides during the war, and at Oxford he'd kept his political opinions to himself. He was good at that, at being carefully non-committal, at avoiding positions that might prove dangerous later. It was a skill that would serve him well throughout his life. The Restoration changed Oxford. Royalist scholars who'd been driven out during the Commonwealth years returned to reclaim their positions. The university became more conservative, more hostile to religious dissent. But it also became more intellectually open in certain ways. Charles II, unlike the Puritan leaders he replaced, was interested in science. He founded the Royal Society, giving official sanction to the experimental philosophy that Locke and his friends had been pursuing in secret. Locke stayed at Christ Church, continuing his studies and beginning to take on teaching responsibilities. He lectured on Greek and rhetoric, competently but without distinction. His colleagues remembered him as serious, hard-working, and somewhat aloof. He had friends, but not many close ones. He was building a reputation as a solid scholar, the kind of man who might eventually become a senior fellow and spend his life teaching undergraduates. Then medicine changed everything. Locke had always been interested in natural philosophy, but his focus had been theoretical. Now he began studying anatomy, reading medical texts, attending dissections. He became friends with physicians, learned about the new chemical theories of disease, started thinking about the body as a machine that could be understood through observation and experiment. He never formally completed a medical degree. The regulations required him to study for years longer than he was willing to wait. And besides, he wasn't sure he wanted to practice medicine as a profession. But the medical study gave him something more valuable than credentials and method. The careful observation, the insistence on evidence, the willingness to question received wisdom. These would become the hallmarks of everything he later wrote. By his mid-30s, Locke had settled into what looked like a comfortable academic career. He had his studentship at Christ Church, which provided income and lodging. He had his medical studies and his experiments. He had a small circle of intellectual friends. It wasn't exciting, but it was safe. For a man whose family had nearly been ruined by choosing the wrong side in a civil war, safety mattered. And then in the summer of 1666, he met a man who would change everything. A man whose political ambitions were as vast as his wealth, who was willing to take risks that terrified more cautious souls. A man who needed someone with Locke's combination of intelligence, discretion, and loyalty. Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, was everything John Locke was not. Where Locke was cautious, Shaftesbury was bold. Where Locke preferred the quiet of his study, Shaftesbury thrived in the chaos of politics. Where Locke avoided controversy, Shaftesbury seemed to seek it out. The two men should never have become friends, let alone partners, in one of the most dangerous political conspiracies of the century. They met through medicine. Shaftesbury had developed a liver abscess, a painful and potentially fatal condition. The conventional doctors had tried everything: bleeding, purging, exotic compounds that did more harm than good. Nothing worked. Someone suggested consulting John Locke, the Oxford scholar who'd been studying the new medicine. Shaftesbury was desperate enough to try anything. Locke examined the Earl and made a radical suggestion. Instead of more medicines, what if they drained the abscess surgically? It was risky. Infections killed more patients than the original diseases, but Shaftesbury agreed, and Locke, working with a surgeon named Thomas Sydenham, performed the operation. They inserted a silver tube to keep the wound open and allow it to drain. Against all odds, it worked. Shaftesbury recovered. He was grateful, obviously, but gratitude wasn't why he invited Locke to leave Oxford and join his household in London. Shaftesbury had recognised something in the scholar that most people missed. Beneath that careful exterior, beneath all that academic caution, was a mind that questioned everything. The kind of mind that could be useful to a man planning to reshape England's political future. Locke accepted. In 1667, at the age of 35, he left the university that had been his home for nearly 2 decades and moved into Exeter House, Shaftesbury's London mansion. He became secretary, advisor, physician, and friend. More than that, he became Shaftesbury's intellectual collaborator, helping to develop the political philosophy that would guide their actions in the turbulent years ahead. London was a revelation. Locke had spent his entire adult life in Oxford, a world of books and lectures and careful academic debates. Now he was thrust into the centre of power, meeting politicians and merchants, diplomats and spies. Shaftesbury was one of the most powerful men in England, a member of the king's inner council, and suddenly Locke had access to information and conversations that would have been impossible for an Oxford Don. He absorbed everything: the debates about trade policy, the arguments over religious toleration, the constant manoeuvring between the king and parliament, between those who wanted strong royal authority and those who believed power should rest with the people's representatives. These weren't abstract questions anymore. They were immediate, urgent, dangerous. Shaftesbury was convinced that England faced a crisis. Charles II had no legitimate children, which meant the throne would pass to his brother James, the Duke of York, and James was Catholic. In a country that had defined itself against Catholic Europe, in a nation where memories of Mary Tudor's fires still burned, the prospect of a Catholic king was terrifying. Shaftesbury believed James must be excluded from the succession at any cost. This was treason to suggest. The divine right of kings, the principle that royal succession was sacred and unalterable, was still the foundation of English political thought. To propose changing the succession because you disagreed with the heir's religion was to challenge the very basis of monarchy. But Shaftesbury had never been one to let danger stop him. Locke found himself at the centre of this conspiracy, though he was careful never to put anything too explicit in writing. He drafted papers on toleration, arguing that the state had no business enforcing religious conformity. He wrote about property rights and the origins of government. He began developing ideas about natural law and the social contract, though he kept these writings private, locked away in his study. These ideas were too dangerous to publish while Charles II lived. The years at Exeter House were intellectually intoxicating, but politically terrifying. Locke watched as Shaftesbury pushed harder and harder for exclusion, building a political party, the Whigs, to support his cause. He watched the king push back, dissolving Parliament, arresting Shaftesbury's allies, making clear that he would not tolerate any challenge to his brother's right to the throne. The country was sliding toward another civil war, and Locke was on the wrong side. In 1681, Shaftesbury was arrested and charged with treason. He was acquitted, but only barely. The king was closing in. Shaftesbury fled to Holland in 1682 and died there a few months later, his great cause defeated. Locke, suddenly vulnerable as the dead man's closest associate, made his own decision. In September 1683, he followed Shaftesbury into exile. He left England secretly, travelling under an assumed name. The government was arresting anyone suspected of involvement in what they called the Rye House Plot, an alleged conspiracy to assassinate the king and his brother. Locke had not been part of any assassination plan, but that might not matter if he were arrested and questioned. Better to disappear. Holland became his refuge for the next 5 years. He lived quietly, moving between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, keeping his head down, writing, always writing. The books that would make him famous were taking shape in these exile years. An essay concerning human understanding, his masterwork on the nature of knowledge and the limits of reason. 2 treatises of government, his revolutionary argument for why people had the right to overthrow tyrants. A letter concerning toleration, his plea for religious freedom. He couldn't publish any of it. Not yet. Charles II was still alive, and his spies were everywhere. Even in Holland, Locke had to be careful. He used false names, moved frequently, trusted almost no one. The manuscripts stayed locked in his trunk, waiting for the world to change. The world changed in February 1685 when Charles II died and James II became king. Everything Shaftesbury had feared came to pass. James immediately began promoting Catholics to positions of power, alienating the Protestant establishment that had supported his brother. He claimed the right to suspend laws passed by Parliament. He kept a standing army, that ancient symbol of tyranny that Englishmen had learned to dread. Within 3 years, he had managed to unite virtually everyone against him. In 1688, 7 English lords sent a secret invitation to William of Orange, the Protestant ruler of Holland, who was married to James's daughter Mary. They asked him to invade England and claim the throne. William agreed. In November 1688, he landed with an army at Torbay in Devon. James's forces deserted him. The king fled to France. Parliament declared that James had abdicated and offered the crown to William and Mary jointly. It was a revolution accomplished almost without bloodshed, and it transformed England's constitution forever. John Locke returned home in February 1689, sailing with the fleet that brought the new queen to her kingdom. He was 56 years old. He'd spent nearly 6 years in exile, most of his adult life in the shadow of more powerful men, always careful, always cautious, always waiting. Now finally it was safe to speak. His books began appearing almost immediately. The letter concerning toleration was published first in Latin, then quickly translated into English. It argued that the state had no business enforcing religious belief, that conscience could not be compelled, that diversity of faith was not a threat but a strength. In a country exhausted by religious conflict, it was a message many were ready to hear. Then came the 2 treatises of government, published anonymously but quickly attributed to Locke. The second treatise was Dynamite. Locke argued that government was not a divine institution, but a human creation, established by consent of the governed for specific purposes. People had natural rights to life, liberty, and property that existed before government, and that government was created to protect. When a ruler violated those rights, when he became a tyrant, the people had not just the right, but the duty to remove him. This was the philosophical justification for everything that had just happened. The glorious revolution wasn't treason, wasn't rebellion, wasn't a violation of divine order. It was the people of England exercising their natural right to choose their government. James had broken the social contract. William and Mary represented the restoration of legitimate authority based on consent. The timing was perfect. Locke hadn't written the second treatise to justify the revolution. He'd written it years earlier, probably during the exclusion crisis. But by holding it back until the political situation changed, he'd created a work that seemed to speak directly to the moment. It became the intellectual foundation for the new order, the explanation of why what had happened was not just necessary, but right. The essay concerning human understanding appeared in December 1689, a massive work that had been gestating for nearly 20 years. It asked a simple question: how do we know what we know? The answer Locke provided would reshape philosophy for the next century. There are no innate ideas, Locke argued. We are not born with knowledge already imprinted on our souls. The mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Everything we know comes from experience, from sensation and reflection on those sensations. This was a direct challenge to the rationalist tradition, to Descartes and his followers, who believed that certain truths were built into the structure of reason itself. If knowledge comes from experience, then it's limited by experience. We can't know the ultimate nature of things, the real essences that philosophers had been debating for centuries. We can only know how things appear to us, how they affect our senses, what patterns we observe. It was a modest epistemology, but also a liberating one. Stop arguing about abstract essences, Locke was saying. Pay attention to the world as it actually presents itself to us. The implications rippled outward. If we're not born with innate ideas, then we're not born with innate moral principles either. Morality must be learned, must be taught, must be justified through reason and experience. This made education crucial, made the formation of character through proper upbringing the key to creating a good society. It also meant that different societies might develop different moral codes, that there was no single universal standard imprinted on every human soul. Locke was careful to avoid the full implications of this relativism. He insisted that morality was still objective, still grounded in natural law, still something reason could discover. But the foundation had shifted. Authority, tradition, revelation, none of these could substitute for the individual's own rational investigation of what was right. Within months, Locke had become the most famous philosopher in England. His works were debated in coffee houses and university halls. Critics attacked his empiricism as leading to skepticism and atheism. Defenders praised his clear thinking and his commitment to reason over dogma. Everyone recognized that something important had happened, that the intellectual landscape had shifted. Locke himself remained characteristically cautious. He refused to put his name on the treatises of government, understanding that despite the revolution, these ideas were still potentially dangerous. He engaged in philosophical debates through letters and published replies, but always maintained a certain distance, a certain reserve. Fame made him uncomfortable. He'd spent too many years learning to keep his head down. He settled into a comfortable existence, dividing his time between London and the country home of his friends the Mashams at Oates in Essex. He held a government position as Commissioner of Trade, work he took seriously and performed competently. He corresponded with intellectuals across Europe, revised his works for new editions, wrote new essays on education and religion. It was the life he'd always wanted: financially secure, intellectually engaged, politically safe at last. But the ideas he'd unleashed would not stay contained. The second treatise was already being read in ways he hadn't quite intended. If governments were based on consent, who exactly got to consent? Locke had assumed it was property owners, men of substance and education. But the logic pointed towards something more radical. If all men were born equal, if rights were natural rather than granted by government, then why should anyone be excluded? These questions would haunt the next century. The questions would haunt the next century, but Locke wouldn't be there to answer them. By the late 1690s, his health was failing. The asthma that had plagued him since childhood was growing worse. His breathing became laboured, his energy diminished. He spent more time at Oates, less in the bustle of London. The house in Essex was quiet, surrounded by gardens and fields. It was a good place to think, to write, to watch the seasons change. He continued working. There were always new additions to prepare, objections to answer, ideas to refine. His essay concerning human understanding went through multiple printings, each one incorporating his responses to critics. He wrote a lengthy defense of his views on religious toleration, pushing the argument even further. He drafted thoughts on education that would later be published as Some Thoughts Concerning Education, a work that would influence pedagogical theory for generations. But the pace had slowed. The man who had once hidden his manuscripts and fled across the English Channel now wrote with the calm assurance of someone whose battles were mostly won. The glorious revolution had succeeded. William and Mary ruled according to the principles Locke had articulated. Religious toleration, while imperfect, had expanded. The intellectual climate had shifted in his direction. He wasn't naive about it. He knew that power remained concentrated in too few hands, that toleration didn't extend to Catholics or atheists, that the property requirements for voting excluded most of the population. But compared to the world of Charles II, compared to the days when Shaftesbury's life hung by a thread, this was progress, incremental, imperfect, but real. His last years were spent in contemplation and correspondence. He wrote long letters to friends, discussing philosophy, politics, and the state of his garden. He read voraciously, keeping up with the latest scientific discoveries and theological debates. He maintained his friendship with Newton, the two great minds of their age exchanging thoughts on everything from biblical prophecy to the nature of space and time. There were personal losses. His friend James Tyrrell, who had been with him since Oxford, died in 1702. Other old companions followed. The generation that had lived through the Civil War, the Restoration, and the Revolution was passing away. Locke found himself increasingly a survivor, a link to a turbulent past that the younger generation knew only from books. He revised his will carefully. There were bequests to friends, to servants who had cared for him, to the Mashams who had given him a home. He specified that his book should be sold and the proceeds used to help educate poor children. Even in death, the philosopher of education and opportunity wanted to extend a hand to those born without advantages. On October 28th, 1704, as Lady Masham sat reading psalms aloud, John Locke died quietly at Oates. He was 72 years old. He'd lived through one of the most turbulent periods in English history and helped create the intellectual framework for a new kind of politics, a new understanding of knowledge, a new conception of human nature. The funeral was simple. He was buried in the churchyard at High Laver, a small village near Oates. The tombstone he'd designed himself was modest, giving his dates and a Latin inscription, asking God to accept him as he was. No grand monument, no elaborate praise, just a simple marker for a man who changed the world by changing how people thought. But the ideas he'd planted were just beginning to grow. Within a generation, they would cross the Atlantic and take root in soil he'd never seen. In 1776, a Virginia planter named Thomas Jefferson sat in a rented room in Philadelphia, trying to write a declaration. He needed to explain why 13 colonies were breaking away from the British Empire, needed to articulate principles that would justify revolution, not just to Americans, but to the world. He reached for ideas that were by then commonplace among educated colonists, ideas they'd absorbed through reading and debate. The words came easily because Locke had written them first. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke had written life, liberty, and property. Jefferson's substitution was deliberate, broadening the concept, but the structure remained Locke's. Natural rights that existed before government, that no government could legitimately take away. The social contract theory that government existed to protect these rights. The radical claim that when government failed in this purpose, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. The Declaration of Independence is essentially a Lockean document, applying the Second Treatise's principles to the specific case of American grievances against George III. Jefferson and the other founders had read Locke, studied Locke, absorbed Locke so thoroughly that his ideas seemed like common sense. That's the mark of a truly influential philosopher, when their revolutionary ideas become so widely accepted that people forget they were ever revolutionary. The Constitution that followed 11 years later embodied more Lockean principles. The separation of powers, the checks and balances, the limitations on government authority, the protection of individual rights through a Bill of Rights, added shortly after ratification. All of this reflected the fundamental Lockean insight that power needed to be constrained, that no person or institution could be trusted with absolute authority. James Madison, the Constitution's primary architect, had studied Locke at Princeton. So had many of the other delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They were working out the practical details of implementing ideas Locke had developed in the abstract. How do you actually create a government based on consent? How do you protect individual rights while maintaining order? How do you balance majority rule with minority protections? The answers they developed weren't always Locke's answers. Locke had assumed a relatively simple government with a strong executive and a legislative body representing property owners. The Americans created something more complex, with federal and state powers carefully balanced, with an independent judiciary, with more explicit protections for individual liberty. But the framework was Lockean. Across the Atlantic, the French were reading Locke too. When revolution came to France in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen echoed Locke's language about natural rights and the social contract. The revolutionaries saw themselves as implementing Enlightenment principles, chief among them the ideas of the English philosopher who'd written in exile nearly a century before. The French Revolution would take a darker turn than anything Locke had imagined, descending into terror and dictatorship. But that wasn't Locke's fault. His ideas about limited government, constitutional checks, and gradual reform were meant to prevent exactly the kind of violent upheaval that occurred in France. The revolutionaries took the radical parts of his theory, the right to resist unjust government, and ignored the cautious, pragmatic parts about working within existing institutions when possible. Throughout the 19th century, as democratic and liberal movements spread across Europe and Latin America, Locke's ideas provided the intellectual ammunition. Reformers arguing for expanded voting rights, for constitutional limits on monarchical power, for religious toleration and free expression, all drew on arguments Locke had made. He became the patron saint of liberal democracy. His works required reading for anyone interested in political theory. But there was a darker side to Locke's legacy that later generations would have to confront. His investments in the slave trade, his involvement in colonial administration, his writings that justified appropriating Native American land. These cast a shadow over his claims about universal human rights and natural equality. How could someone who wrote so eloquently about liberty defend slavery? How could someone who insisted that all men were created equal participate in systems of oppression? The answer is uncomfortable but important. Locke, like Jefferson and most of the founders who followed him, didn't fully live up to his own principles. He carved out exceptions, found rationalizations, allowed economic interests and cultural prejudices to override philosophical commitments. The ideas were better than the man, more radical in their implications than even their author realized. Later thinkers would use Locke's own arguments to condemn slavery and colonialism. If all men are born equal, if rights are natural and universal, then these rights must apply to everyone, not just to European property owners. The abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, anti-colonial struggles across the globe all drew on Lockean principles to argue that the system wasn't living up to its stated values. This is how intellectual progress happens, not through perfect thinkers who get everything right, but through ideas that contain within themselves the seeds of their own expansion and correction. Locke's theory of natural rights was limited by his time and place, by his own blind spots and compromises. But the theory itself pointed towards something more universal, something that could be used to challenge the very limitations Locke himself had accepted. In the 20th century, as totalitarian regimes demonstrated what happened when government power went unchecked, Locke's arguments for limited government and individual rights took on renewed urgency. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, is deeply Lockean in its insistence that certain rights are universal, that they exist independent of any particular government or culture, that protecting them is a fundamental purpose of political organization. Philosophers continued to debate and refine Locke's ideas. John Rawls, perhaps the most influential political philosopher of the late 20th century, built his theory of justice on foundations Locke had laid, arguing for a social contract that would be fair to all participants. Robert Nozick took Locke's emphasis on property rights and developed a libertarian theory of minimal government. Communitarian critics challenged Locke's individualism, arguing that he'd underestimated the importance of community and tradition. But even the critics engaged with Locke acknowledged his importance, defined their own positions in relation to his. You couldn't talk about political philosophy without talking about Locke. He'd set the terms of the debate. Today, when we argue about the proper role of government, about individual rights versus collective needs, about the social contract and its obligations, we're still working through questions Locke raised. When we debate privacy rights in the digital age, we're applying Lockean principles about the inviolability of the person. When we discuss immigration and citizenship, we're grappling with Lockean ideas about consent and political obligation. When we argue about economic regulation, we're revisiting Locke's thoughts on property and the limits of government power. The world Locke helped create is the world we live in. Representative democracy, constitutional government, individual rights, religious toleration, these are so fundamental to modern political life that it's hard to imagine alternatives, but they weren't inevitable. They had to be thought through, argued for, fought for. Locke did the thinking and the arguing, others did the fighting. Walk through Washington, D.C., and you're walking through a Lockean landscape. The Capitol building, where elected representatives make laws. The Supreme Court, where those laws are tested against constitutional principles. The monuments to leaders who governed according to rules rather than personal whim. All of this embodies ideas that a 17th century English philosopher worked out while hiding from a king. The system worked, not perfectly, never perfectly, but it worked better than what came before. The question we need to ask now is whether it can work for what comes next. But before we look forward, we need to understand something crucial about Locke that most people miss. The philosopher who argued for revolution, for the right to overthrow tyrants, spent the last years of his life terrified of exactly that happening. After the Glorious Revolution succeeded and William and Mary took the throne, Locke finally came home. He was 60 years old. He'd spent 6 years in exile, always looking over his shoulder, always ready to run. Now he could stop running. He settled in a manor house called Oates in Essex, the home of Sir Francis and Lady Damaris Masham. Damaris was the daughter of Ralph Cudworth, the Cambridge philosopher Locke had admired in his youth. She was brilliant in her own right, a philosopher and theologian who wrote under a male pseudonym because women weren't supposed to write philosophy. Their relationship was deep and complicated. Some historians suggest they'd been in love years earlier, that circumstances had prevented marriage, that this arrangement was a kind of reconciliation. Whatever the truth, Locke lived at Oates for the final 14 years of his life, working in the library, conversing with Damaris, watching the political world he'd helped create take shape. The new government offered him positions. Would he like to be an ambassador? No. A university post? No. He accepted only one role, Commissioner of Trade and Plantations, a position that let him influence economic policy without the spotlight of high office. He served for several years before his health forced him to resign, because Locke was sick. His lungs had never recovered from the Dutch air, from the years of strain and stress. He suffered from asthma, from what was probably chronic bronchitis. Breathing became harder. He couldn't walk long distances. The vigorous man who'd once hiked through France was now confined to his study and garden. But his mind remained sharp, and what occupied that mind increasingly was fear. Fear that the revolution he justified might go too far. The radical ideas he'd put into the world were being used by people he didn't approve of, in ways he didn't intend. Religious dissenters were demanding full equality, not just toleration. Political radicals were questioning property qualifications for voting. Some were even suggesting that women should have political rights. Locke pulled back. When his friend James Tyrrell published work defending popular sovereignty, Locke privately urged caution. When deists began using Lockean arguments about reason and revelation to attack Christianity altogether, Locke wrote treatises defending the reasonableness of Christian doctrine. When economic thinkers pushed his property theory toward conclusions about redistribution of wealth, Locke insisted that property rights were sacred and inviolable. The revolutionary was becoming a conservative, not because he'd changed his principles, but because he saw those principles being taken to conclusions he'd never intended. This is the pattern with radical ideas. They escape their creator's control. In 1695, Parliament allowed the Licensing Act to expire, effectively ending government censorship of the press. Locke had argued for this for years. Freedom of thought required freedom to publish. But when the presses began churning out materials he found dangerous, irreligious tracts, political pamphlets calling for universal suffrage, pornographic novels, he wondered whether he'd been right. He never said he'd been wrong. He believed in his principles. But he began to emphasize different aspects of his thought. The duty to obey legitimate government, the importance of property, the need for religion as a foundation of morality, the dangers of enthusiasm and fanaticism. His health continued to decline. By 1700, he could barely leave his room. He spent his days reading scripture, revising his works, corresponding with friends. He prepared himself for death with the same methodical attention he'd given to philosophy. He died on October 28th, 1704, while Damaris Masham read psalms aloud. He was 72 years old. The funeral was small, private, exactly as he'd wanted. No grand monuments, no elaborate eulogies. He was buried in the churchyard at High Lava, beneath a stone he'd composed himself, describing him as a man who lived content with his modest lot. Modest, that word again. The man who'd helped overthrow a king and reshape political philosophy presented himself to eternity as someone who'd lived a quiet, ordinary life. The epitaph was vintage Locke, self-effacing, careful, determined to control how he'd be remembered. But history had other plans. Within years of his death, the second treatise was being read across Europe and the American colonies. Voltaire visited England in the 1720s and returned to France convinced that Locke had solved philosophy's fundamental problems. His essay concerning human understanding became required reading at universities. His thoughts on education influenced how aristocrats raised their children. But the real impact came later, in the hands of revolutionaries who saw in Locke's measured prose a justification for something far more radical than he'd ever intended. The American colonists didn't just read Locke, they absorbed him. His ideas were in the air they breathed. When they began articulating grievances against Britain in the 1760s and 70s, they reached for Lockean language almost instinctively. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple copies of Locke's works. He'd read them so thoroughly that phrases and concepts had become part of how he thought. When he sat down in June 1776 to draft the Declaration of Independence, Locke was there in the room with him, invisible but present. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's not Locke's language exactly, but the idea that certain truths are self-evident, discoverable by reason, fundamental to human understanding, that's pure Locke. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Locke had said natural rights. Jefferson said unalienable. Same concept. Rights that exist prior to government, that can't be surrendered or taken away. That form the basis of legitimate political authority. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke had written life, liberty, and property. Jefferson substituted happiness, perhaps to avoid the uncomfortable implications of defending property rights in a document partly concerned with limiting British interference in the slave trade. But the structure is identical. 3 fundamental rights that define what it means to be human, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the second treatise condensed into a single sentence. Government exists to protect rights. Its legitimacy comes from consent, no legitimate authority. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The right of revolution, the ultimate Lockean principle. If government violates the trust placed in it, the people can overthrow it and start again. The Declaration of Independence is a Lockean document, not a copy. Jefferson was too good a writer for that. But Locke provided the framework, the concepts, the vocabulary. The American Revolution was justified in Lockean terms before a single shot was fired. The French Revolution came next, and it was more complicated. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in August 1789, echoed Locke's language about natural rights and popular sovereignty. But the revolution quickly moved beyond anything Locke would have recognised or approved. The Reign of Terror, the execution of the king, the attempt to remake society from scratch according to rational principles, this was Rousseau more than Locke. Where Locke emphasised stability, tradition, gradual reform, the French revolutionaries embraced radical transformation. Where Locke defended property, they confiscated it. Where Locke preached toleration, they demanded conformity to revolutionary virtue. Yet even the French radicals claimed Locke as a forefather. They saw themselves as fulfilling his principles, taking them to their logical conclusion. If all men are created equal, why should anyone have hereditary privileges? If government derives from consent, why not let everyone vote? If property is natural, why should the few own everything while the many starve? Locke would have been horrified. But he'd created the tools they used to build their revolution, and tools don't care how they're wielded. Throughout the 19th century, Locke's influence continued to spread. The liberal movements that pushed for constitutional government, for expanded voting rights, for freedom of the press, all drew on Lockean foundations. John Stuart Mill's defence of individual liberty was built on ground Locke had cleared. The slow expansion of democracy in Britain, the revolutions of 1848 across Europe, the gradual emergence of human rights as a concept, all of this happened in Locke's shadow. But challenges emerged too. Marxists argued that Locke's emphasis on property rights was just a cover for class domination, that his social contract was a myth designed to justify bourgeois exploitation. Conservatives complained that Lockean individualism dissolved the bonds of community and tradition. Utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham called natural rights nonsense upon stilts, insisting that rights were useful fictions rather than eternal truths. Feminist thinkers pointed out that Locke's universal principles somehow applied only to men. The social contract he described was actually a sexual contract, one that established male authority over women, even as it limited government authority over male property owners. His theories of consent didn't extend to marriage, where women had no legal standing independent of their husbands. Anti-colonial movements used Locke's principles to challenge European imperialism, pointing out the contradiction between claiming natural rights for Europeans while denying them to colonized peoples. If the right to property comes from mixing labour with land, what about indigenous peoples who'd been labouring on their land for centuries before Europeans arrived? These critiques didn't destroy Locke's influence. They complicated it. They showed that his principles were more radical than he'd realised, that they contained implications he'd never accepted, that the logic of natural rights and consent could be used to challenge structures he'd taken for granted. This is how ideas work. They grow beyond their origins. They're taken up by people the original thinker never imagined, applied to situations he never encountered, pushed to conclusions he never endorsed. An idea, once released, belongs to history, not to its author. By the 20th century, Locke had become foundational to liberal democracy. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted after World War II, the fingerprints were Locke's. Article 3. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 17. Everyone has the right to own property. Article 21. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. The language was modernised, universalised, stripped of Locke's theological references and 17th century context. But the core ideas remained: natural rights, limited government, popular sovereignty, consent as the basis of legitimate authority. Political philosophers continued to debate Locke's legacy. Robert Nozick built a libertarian theory on Lockean foundations, arguing for minimal government and absolute property rights. John Rawls challenged Lockean assumptions about property while accepting his framework of rights and consent. Alasdair MacIntyre attacked the entire liberal tradition, Locke included, as morally bankrupt. But even the critics had to engage with Locke. You couldn't talk about modern political philosophy without addressing the questions he'd raised and the answers he'd provided. He'd set the agenda. Today, 3 centuries after his death, we still live in a Lockean world. When we debate healthcare as a right, we're using a framework Locke established. When we argue about government surveillance and privacy, we're applying Lockean principles about the limits of state power. When we discuss consent in everything from medical treatment to sexual relationships, we're extending ideas Locke developed about political legitimacy. The specific applications would baffle him. He never imagined the internet, global markets, nuclear weapons, climate change, artificial intelligence, but the questions remain his questions. What are rights? Where do they come from? What makes government legitimate? When can we resist authority? How do we balance individual freedom with collective needs? We don't have final answers. Locke didn't either. What he gave us was a way of thinking about these questions, a vocabulary for discussing them, a framework for working towards solutions. The framework has been challenged, modified, expanded, but it endures. Because here's what Locke understood that makes him still relevant. Political authority is a problem that requires justification. It's not natural, not given, not something we can take for granted. Every generation has to work out for itself why some people get to make rules that others must follow, and what limits constrain that power. He didn't solve the problem. He showed us how to think about it. That's enough to change the world. The ideas were out there now, circulating through pamphlets and coffee houses, whispered in taverns and debated in universities. But the man who'd unleashed them was dying, and he knew it. By 1704, John Locke's health had deteriorated beyond recovery. The asthma that had plagued him since childhood had worsened, his breathing was laboured, his strength was failing. He spent most of his time in a chair by the fire at Oates, the country house where he'd lived for the past decade as a guest of the Masham family. He was 72 years old. He'd outlived most of his generation. Shaftesbury was long dead. Charles II was dead. James II was in exile. William III had died 2 years earlier. The world Locke had helped create was moving forward without him. He put his affairs in order with characteristic precision. He revised his will. He organised his papers. He wrote letters to friends, brief and unsentimental. He was not a man given to emotional displays. Even dying, he maintained his composure. On October 28th, 1704, Damaris Masham sat with him as he grew weaker. She'd been his closest companion for years, the intellectual friend he'd never quite married, though they'd shared a deep affection that transcended conventional categories. He asked her to read to him from the Psalms, not because he'd become suddenly devout in his final hours. He'd always believed in God, always maintained that Christianity was rational. But the Psalms offered comfort, and comfort seemed appropriate now. As she read, Locke closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, then stopped. There was no drama, no final pronouncement. He simply slipped away, as quietly as he'd lived much of his life. They buried him in the churchyard at High Laver, a small village near Oates. The grave marker bore a Latin inscription he'd written himself. It was modest, factual, almost clinical. He listed his accomplishments without boast, noted his character without embellishment, and concluded with the observation that his virtues, such as they were too small to be praised. It was perfectly Lockean, reasonable, measured, slightly self-deprecating. Even in death he refused to claim more than he'd earned. The obituaries were respectful, but not effusive. He was remembered as a learned man, a respected philosopher, a contributor to public discourse. But nobody predicted that his influence would grow rather than fade, that his ideas would prove more powerful dead than alive. Because something interesting happens to ideas after their author dies. They become available for use in ways the author never controlled. They get interpreted, reinterpreted, applied to situations the original thinker never imagined. They escape the limitations of their creator's intentions and take on lives of their own. Locke had written for his own time, addressing specific problems in 17th century England, but the principles he'd articulated turned out to be portable. They could be lifted from their original context and applied elsewhere, and they were. Within decades, his works were being read across Europe and in the American colonies. The essay concerning human understanding became required reading for anyone claiming to be educated. The two treatises of government circulated among political reformers and revolutionaries. The letter concerning toleration influenced debates about religious freedom from Boston to Berlin. But the real transformation came in the 18th century, when a new generation took Locke's ideas and used them to challenge structures he'd taken for granted. Starts with slavery. Locke had invested in the Royal African Company. He'd helped write the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which explicitly protected slavery. His own philosophy seemed to permit it, at least under certain conditions. But here's what happened. Abolitionists read Locke and found in his work the weapons they needed. If all men are created equal, if natural rights belong to humans as such, if consent is required for legitimate authority, then slavery is indefensible. It violates everything Locke claimed to believe. The argument was there in his own writings, waiting to be activated. He hadn't seen it, or hadn't wanted to see it. But others did. Granville Sharp, one of Britain's first abolitionists, cited Locke's principle that no one can be subjected to political power without their consent. How could slavery be justified when slaves had never consented to their condition? James Otis, the American lawyer, used Locke's natural rights theory to argue that slavery violated natural law. The colonists are by the law of nature free-born, as indeed all men are, white or black. The logic was Lockean even when the conclusion contradicted Locke's practice. The ideas had grown beyond their author. Women's rights followed a similar pattern. Locke had said nothing about women's political equality. His theory of consent applied to male heads of household. Women were governed through their husbands and fathers. Mary Astle saw the contradiction immediately. In 1700, she wrote a devastating critique. If all men are born free, as Mr. Locke says, why are all women born slaves? If absolute sovereignty is tyrannical in government, why is it acceptable in families? Astle wasn't claiming Locke as a feminist. She was showing that his principles, if applied consistently, led to conclusions he'd never accepted. The framework he'd built could be turned against the assumptions he'd left unexamined. A century later, Mary Wollstonecraft would make the argument explicit. A vindication of the rights of woman applied Lockean reasoning to women's education and political status. If reason is what qualifies humans for rights, and women possess reason, then women possess rights. The logic was simple, brutal, and borrowed directly from Locke's own method. Property rights became another battleground. Locke had argued that labour creates property rights. You mix your labour with something, it becomes yours. Simple enough. But what about inherited wealth? What about land monopolies? What about systems where a few people own everything and most people own nothing? Critics pointed out that Locke's labour theory, taken seriously, would undermine most existing property relations. If only labour creates legitimate ownership, then aristocratic estates acquired through conquest or inheritance have no moral foundation. Radical reformers like Thomas Paine used Locke's principles to argue for land redistribution and inheritance taxes. If the earth belongs to everyone in common, as Locke had said, then how did a small elite get to control it all? Socialists went further. If labour creates value, they argued, then workers should own the products of their labour. Capitalism, which separates workers from ownership, violates Lockean principles. Locke would have rejected these conclusions. He'd explicitly defended inheritance and unlimited accumulation, but the arguments were there in his work, latent, waiting for someone to draw them out. Colonial governance presented the sharpest contradictions. Locke had helped govern Carolina. He'd invested in colonial ventures. He'd written about America as empty land, conveniently ignoring the people who already lived there. But his theory of consent created problems for empire. If government requires the consent of the governed, what about colonies? The people in India or Jamaica or Massachusetts hadn't consented to British rule. They were subjects, not citizens. They had no representation, no voice, no way to withdraw consent. American revolutionaries seized on this. No taxation without representation was a Lockean argument. The colonies were being governed without their consent. By Locke's own standards, resistance was justified. The Declaration of Independence reads like a compressed version of the Second Treatise. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Jefferson changed property to pursuit of happiness, but the framework was pure Locke. When the Americans listed their grievances against George III, they were following Locke's script. The king had violated the social contract. He'd exceeded his authority. The people had the right to dissolve the political bands, connecting them to Britain, and establish new governments. It was Locke's argument, transplanted across the Atlantic, used to justify rebellion against the British Empire that Locke himself had served. The French revolutionaries went even further. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed universal principles that Locke had never quite articulated in universal terms. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, not Englishmen, not property owners, men, all of them. The French were radicalizing Locke, pushing his logic beyond the boundaries he'd accepted. He'd argued for religious toleration, but not for atheists. They proclaimed freedom of conscience for everyone. He'd defended property as sacred. They confiscated aristocratic estates. He'd supported constitutional monarchy. They executed the king. These weren't perversions of Locke's philosophy. They were extensions. The principles, once unleashed, led to conclusions he'd never imagined or would never have endorsed. By the 19th century, Locke had become a problem for everyone. Conservatives quoted him to defend property rights and limited government. Radicals quoted him to attack inherited privilege and demand universal suffrage. Liberals quoted him to support constitutional reform. Each group found what they needed in his work. This wasn't dishonest. It was how ideas function. Locke had provided tools, concepts, frameworks. Different people used them for different purposes. The tools were genuine, even when the results contradicted each other. Think about natural rights. Locke had grounded them in God's design and human reason. But what if you don't believe in God? What if you think reason is culturally constructed rather than universal? Enlightenment thinkers tried to secularize Locke, keeping the rights while discarding the theology. Jeremy Bentham attacked the whole concept as nonsense upon stilts. If rights aren't natural, if they're just legal fictions created by governments, then the entire Lockean edifice collapses. But the language of natural rights proved remarkably resilient. Even Bentham's utilitarian followers found themselves appealing to individual liberty and limited government, the very things Locke had defended. The vocabulary was too useful to abandon. Whether or not rights were truly natural, talking about them as if they were provided a powerful tool for challenging authority. Modern political philosophy is still working through these tensions. Libertarians embrace Locke's defense of property and minimal government. Socialists embrace his labor theory of value while rejecting his conclusions about accumulation. Liberals try to balance both impulses, defending rights while accepting redistribution. None of these positions is purely Lockean. All of them draw on Locke. The contradictions in his work turned out to be productive. They generated debate, forced clarification, pushed people to think harder about what they actually believed. Consider his argument about consent. It sounds clear until you start asking questions. What counts as consent? Silence, residence, voting? What about people who can't consent? Children, the mentally ill future generations? Locke said that tacit consent was enough. You consent to government by owning property or simply living within its territory. But that seems to make consent meaningless. If you can't withdraw it, if you can't avoid it, is it really consent? Critics have been pointing this out for 3 centuries. And yet the idea persists that legitimate government requires some form of consent, however we define it. We can't seem to let go of the principle even when we can't make it work cleanly. Or take his labour theory of property. You mix your labour with unowned resources, they become yours. But how much can you claim? Locke said you can take as much as you can use without waste, leaving enough and as good for others. That qualification, enough and as good, is doing enormous work. In a world of finite resources, can anyone claim ownership without diminishing what's available to others? If not, does private property become impossible to justify? Locke thought the qualification was satisfied because the world was vast and mostly empty. He was wrong about that. So what happens to his theory when the world fills up? These aren't academic puzzles. They're live questions about how we organize society, distribute resources, and justify or challenge existing arrangements. Locke gave us a framework that's both powerful and incomplete. The power comes from its simplicity. Rights, consent, limited government. These are ideas people can grasp and apply. The incompleteness comes from the gaps and contradictions Locke never resolved. What rights? Whose consent? How limited? Every generation has to work out the details for themselves. Locke pointed the direction. He didn't provide the map, and maybe that's why his influence endures. If he'd solved everything, we'd have moved on. If he'd been completely wrong, we'd have discarded him. But he was right enough to be useful, and incomplete enough to require constant reinterpretation. The questions he raised are permanent. The answers keep changing. That's not a bug. It's the feature that makes him still relevant. John Locke's contradictions weren't just theoretical puzzles. They were about to collide with reality in the most violent way imaginable. Because across the Atlantic, in 13 British colonies, people were reading his words and preparing to act on them. The American Revolution didn't start with Locke. It started with taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, tea dumped in Boston Harbor. These were practical grievances about money and power, not abstract philosophy. But when colonists needed to justify their resistance, when they needed to explain why rebellion might be legitimate, they reached for Locke's arguments. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple editions of the 2 treatises. So did John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison. These weren't decorative volumes sitting on shelves. They were working texts, annotated and argued over. When the Continental Congress needed someone to draft a declaration explaining why America was breaking from Britain, they chose Jefferson, partly because everyone knew he could channel Locke. The result was a document that reads like Locke's greatest hits. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's Locke's natural law, repackaged as common sense, that all men are created equal. Locke's state of nature, where no one has natural authority over anyone else, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Natural rights given not by government but by nature or God. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke had said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson swapped property for happiness, perhaps to avoid the obvious hypocrisy of slave owners claiming property rights. The structure of the argument was pure Locke. Governments are instituted to secure rights. They derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive of these ends, people have the right to alter or abolish it. This wasn't Jefferson being clever. This was Locke's theory of revolution, applied to King George III instead of King James II. But notice what happened in the translation. Locke had been cautious, defensive, backward-looking. He was justifying a revolution that had already happened, explaining why removing one king and installing another had been legitimate. The Americans were bolder. They weren't replacing one monarch with another. They were rejecting monarchy entirely. They were doing what Locke had described but probably never imagined, creating a government from scratch based explicitly on consent and natural rights. The Declaration was propaganda, of course, a justification for rebellion written by rebels, but it was also philosophy made practical. Locke had provided the theory. The Americans provided the experiment. Could you actually build a government on these principles? Not just use them to justify replacing a bad king, but use them as the foundation for something new? The answer was complicated. The Declaration said all men are created equal. The Constitution that followed 7 years later counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. The Declaration said government derives its power from consent of the governed. The Constitution gave the vote to perhaps 20% of the population. White men with property. Everyone else was governed without consenting. This wasn't just hypocrisy, though it was that. It was the inevitable collision between Locke's universal language and particular interests. Rights are natural and inalienable, but somehow not for slaves, women, indigenous peoples, or the poor. Consent is necessary for legitimacy, but somehow property qualifications for voting don't violate it. Liberty is sacred, but somehow you can own other human beings. The founders knew this was a problem. They argued about it, worried over it, tried to finesse it with careful wording. Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration included a passage condemning slavery and blaming it on King George. The Southern delegates forced him to remove it. Everyone understood the contradiction. They just couldn't resolve it without blowing up the coalition they needed to win independence. So they kicked it down the road. The Constitution mentioned slavery without naming it. Persons held to service. The slave trade could continue for 20 years. Then Congress could decide. Fugitive slaves had to be returned. The whole system depended on an institution that contradicted the founding principles, but those principles were useful for other purposes, so they stayed. The result was a government built on Lockean foundations with a massive crack running through the middle. Natural rights, except for these people. Consent of the governed, except from these people. Limited government, except when we need to enforce property rights in human beings. Frederick Douglass saw this clearly. He was born enslaved, escaped, became one of the most powerful orators of the 19th century. When he spoke about the Constitution, he didn't reject it. He weaponized it. The document, he argued, was anti-slavery in its principles, even if its authors weren't. The language of natural rights and human equality was incompatible with slavery. You couldn't consistently believe both, so the task was to hold America to its own stated principles. This was Locke being used against the contradictions Locke himself had tolerated. Because Locke owned stock in slave trading companies, he helped write the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which explicitly protected slavery. He wasn't bothered by the contradiction between natural liberty and human bondage. But the language he used to defend natural liberty couldn't be contained. Once you say all men are born free and equal, you've created a weapon that can be turned against any hierarchy. Douglass understood this. So did the abolitionists who quoted the Declaration as slavery's defenders. So did Elizabeth Cady Stanton when she wrote the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls in 1848, demanding rights for women using the same Lockean framework. The logic was unstoppable once you accepted the premises. If rights are natural, they can't be restricted to white men. If government requires consent, half the population can't be excluded from giving it. The Civil War settled the slavery question at enormous cost, 600,000 dead. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th promised equal protection. The 15th protected voting rights regardless of race. On paper, America was finally living up to its Lockean principles. On the ground, it wasn't. Reconstruction failed. Jim Crow laws reimposed racial hierarchy. Women still couldn't vote. Indigenous peoples were being dispossessed and slaughtered. The gap between principle and practice remained massive. But something had changed. The principles were now explicit, written into the Constitution itself. You couldn't pretend anymore that equality and rights were meant only for some people. The text said otherwise. This made the hypocrisy visible in a way it hadn't been before. And visible hypocrisy can be challenged. The civil rights movement of the 20th century used exactly this strategy. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't ask for new principles. He demanded America honor the ones it already claimed. When he spoke at the Lincoln Memorial about a promissory note that had come back marked insufficient funds, he was talking about the Declaration and Constitution. The check was written, it just needed to be cashed for everyone, not just white people. This is Locke's legacy playing out across centuries, not because he was consistent or radical or ahead of his time. He wasn't. He was a man of his era with all its blind spots and prejudices, but he articulated principles that were more universal than he realized. Once you say rights are natural, you can't control who claims them. Once you say government requires consent, you can't easily explain why some people's consent doesn't count. The language takes on a life of its own. It gets used by people Locke never imagined for purposes he never intended. Slaves citing natural liberty, women demanding political rights, colonized peoples claiming self-determination. They're all using Locke's framework, often against systems Locke himself supported or tolerated. This pattern isn't unique to America. The French Revolution also drew on Locke, mixing him with Rousseau to produce the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The Haitian Revolution took those principles seriously and abolished slavery, becoming the first nation founded by formerly enslaved people. Latin American independence movements cited natural rights. Asian and African anti-colonial struggles invoked self-determination and consent. Everywhere European empires had spread, Locke's ideas followed, sometimes deliberately, as colonial elites educated in European philosophy learned to think in terms of rights and social contracts. Sometimes indirectly, as the language filtered through culture and politics until it became common sense. The particulars varied, but the pattern held. People used Lockean principles to challenge the very hierarchies and inequalities that existed when Locke wrote. Was this what he intended? Certainly not. Locke defended property, including inherited wealth and colonial appropriation. He supported hierarchy as long as it was justified by merit or consent, rather than divine right. He never suggested that servants, labourers, or women should have political power equal to property-owning men. His radicalism had clear limits, but intention isn't everything. The principles he articulated had implications he didn't pursue. Other people pursued them. They pushed the logic further, applied it more consistently, refused to accept the exceptions and qualifications that Locke had taken for granted. This is why political philosophy matters. Not because philosophers have special wisdom, or because their arguments are unassailable. Most philosophical arguments have holes you could drive a truck through. Locke's certainly do, but philosophy provides language, concepts, and frameworks that people can use to think about their situation and imagine alternatives. Locke gave us a way to talk about political legitimacy that didn't depend on tradition, divine right, or might makes right. Government exists to protect rights. It requires consent. It can be resisted if it fails. These ideas are simple enough to be widely understood and radical enough to to challenge almost any existing arrangement. That's a powerful combination. It's why Locke keeps getting invoked in political struggles centuries after his death. Not because everyone has read him, or because his arguments are perfect, but because the vocabulary he helped create is useful. Rights, consent, legitimacy. These words do work. They allow people to question authority and demand justification. The fact that Locke himself would have opposed many of the movements that use his language is almost beside the point. Ideas escape their origins. They get remixed, reinterpreted, turned toward purposes their creators never imagined. That's not a bug. That's how intellectual history works. Consider what happened with the labour theory of value. Locke said you own what you produce through your labour. He meant this as a justification for private property, especially in colonial contexts where Europeans were mixing their labour with supposedly unowned land. But socialists read the same argument and reach different conclusions. If labour creates value, why do owners get the profit? Shouldn't workers own what they produce? Karl Marx would later build an entire critique of capitalism on this foundation. The worker creates value through labour. The capitalist extracts surplus value as profit. This is exploitation, not legitimate ownership. Marx was inverting Locke's argument, using it against the system Locke defended. But the logic was Lockean. Labour creates property rights. Follow that principle consistently, and you end up challenging wage labour itself. This wasn't what Locke intended. He distinguished between labour you do on your own land or resources and labour you sell to someone else. When you work for wages, you've already consented to give the product to your employer. The employer owns your labour time, so they own what you produce during it. Problem solved. Except socialists asked why this was legitimate. Why should anyone be able to own another person's labour time? If rights are natural and inalienable, can you really sell away your labour permanently? Locke had said you can't sell yourself into slavery, because that would be giving up the natural liberty that's the foundation of all other rights. But wage labour looked suspiciously similar. You're subordinating yourself to another's will, following their commands, producing value they claim as theirs. The debate continues. Libertarians invoke Locke to defend free markets and property rights. Socialists invoke Locke's labour theory to attack the same system. Both sides are using his framework. Both think they're being consistent with his principles. They're just emphasising different parts and following different threads. This multiplicity of interpretation isn't a failure of Locke's system. It's built into the structure of political philosophy. Any powerful framework contains tensions, ambiguities, and points where different principles conflict. Locke gave us several principles: property rights, natural liberty, consent, limited government. They don't always point the same direction. When they conflict, you have to choose which to prioritise. Different people make different choices. That's why Locke remains relevant. Not because he settled everything, but because he articulated principles we're still trying to reconcile. The same pattern plays out with religious toleration. Locke wrote his letter concerning toleration while in exile, watching England tear itself apart over questions of faith. Catholics versus Protestants, Anglicans versus dissenters. Each group convinced that salvation required suppressing the others. Locke proposed a radical solution: stop. The civil magistrate has no business enforcing religious doctrine. Faith is an inward conviction that can't be compelled by force. If you threaten someone into attending church, you haven't saved their soul. You've just created a hypocrite. So separate the domains. Civil government protects life, liberty, and property. Religious communities pursue salvation according to their own lights. Neither should interfere with the other. This sounds reasonable now. It was explosive then. Most people believed that religious unity was essential for social order. Allow heresy to flourish, and you invite God's wrath on the entire nation. The king's duty included protecting the true faith and suppressing error. Locke rejected this completely. Religious belief is voluntary by nature. Coercion produces conformity, not genuine faith. God doesn't want forced worship. He wants freely chosen devotion. Therefore, the state should tolerate all religious opinions that don't threaten civil peace. But there's a catch. Locke included exceptions. Atheists can't be tolerated because without belief in God and divine judgment, they have no reason to keep their promises. Catholics can't be tolerated because they owe allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope. These exclusions undermined the principle. If toleration rests on natural rights and religious freedom, why do atheists and Catholics lose those rights? Locke's answer was essentially pragmatic. They're dangerous. Atheists might break contracts. Catholics might conspire with hostile foreign powers. It's self-defense, not persecution. Later advocates of religious freedom dropped these exceptions. If conscience is sacred, it's sacred for everyone. You can't carve out special categories and claim you're defending universal principles. The Enlightenment thinkers who came after Locke pushed toleration further than he had, extending it to atheists, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and eventually to people who questioned religion entirely. They were being more consistent with Lockean principles than Locke himself. His framework pointed toward universal toleration, even though he stopped short. This happens repeatedly. Someone articulates a principle. They apply it to certain cases, but not others. Later thinkers notice the inconsistency and extend the logic. Locke said all men are created equal, with natural rights. He didn't include women, enslaved people, or colonized populations in that category. Others asked why not. If rights are natural, they can't depend on gender, race, or geography. Either the principle is universal, or it's not a principle. Extending it created political movements Locke would have found incomprehensible. But they were using his language, his concepts, his mode of argument. The framework was built to travel beyond its origins. Consider the right to revolution. Locke was careful about this. Government derives from consent. When rulers violate their trust by attacking the natural rights they're supposed to protect, the people can withdraw consent and establish new government. But Locke added qualifications. Revolution is justified only against sustained tyranny, not for light or transient causes. The people are slow to act. They endure much before rising up. When they finally do revolt, it's because the government has made itself their enemy. This is both radical and conservative. Radical because it denies absolute sovereignty and makes all government conditional. Conservative because it sets a high bar for resistance. You need serious, persistent violations, not just bad policy or personal grievance. The American revolutionaries quoted Locke constantly. The Declaration of Independence reads like an application of the Second Treatise. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lockean language throughout. But was American independence really justified by Locke's standards? The colonists weren't facing systematic tyranny. They were being taxed without representation in Parliament, which they found insulting and unfair. But people in Britain faced similar situations. Plenty of British subjects couldn't vote either. Were the colonists really suffering the kind of sustained assault on fundamental rights that Locke described? You could argue either way. The colonists certainly thought so. They compiled long lists of grievances, trying to show that King George III had violated the social contract repeatedly and deliberately. British loyalists responded that the colonists were exaggerating minor disputes into pretexts for rebellion. Both sides invoked Locke. Both claimed consistency with his principles. The ambiguity in his theory allowed this. What counts as serious enough tyranny to justify revolution? Who decides? Locke said the people judge, but which people? the majority, a motivated minority, regional populations? If Parliament represented Britain but not America, did that matter? These weren't questions Locke had clearly answered. His framework created space for revolutionary claims without determining exactly when they were valid. The French Revolution did something similar. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen echoed Locke. Natural rights, equality before the law, popular sovereignty. But the revolution went places Locke never imagined. Universal male suffrage, abolition of aristocratic privilege, attempts to reorganize society according to rational principles, then terror, dictatorship, and decades of war. Locke had wanted to preserve property and limit government. The French revolutionaries wanted to remake the world. They used his concepts as tools for radical transformation. He would have been horrified, but his ideas enabled their arguments. Once, you establish that government depends on consent, that rights are natural, that people can judge their rulers. You've opened a door that's hard to close. Later movements would push through it regardless of whether the original author approved. The 19th century liberal tradition built directly on Lockean foundations. Constitutional government, rule of law, individual rights, free markets, these became the program of progressive reformers across Europe and America. They weren't just preserving existing arrangements. They were challenging aristocratic privilege, established churches, and absolute monarchies. Locke's theory gave them ammunition. Natural rights meant everyone deserved legal equality. Consent meant ending hereditary rule. Property rights meant economic freedom from feudal restrictions. The liberals thought they were completing the project Locke started, but socialists and feminists noticed that liberal regimes left massive inequalities intact. Property rights protected the wealthy. Voting rights excluded workers and women. Contract freedom allowed exploitation. If rights were truly universal, these exclusions needed justification. None was forthcoming. Locke's principles implied broader equality than his political descendants were willing to accept. The labour movement argued that workers had the same natural liberty as capitalists. Why should one class rule another? If consent legitimates authority, workers should consent to their working conditions. If they don't, the arrangement is tyrannical. The feminist movement asked why women lacked political rights. If humans naturally possess reason and moral agency, gender is irrelevant. Excluding half the population from citizenship violated the foundations of liberal theory. Locke himself had written that political power couldn't rest on natural hierarchies because none existed. The state of nature was a condition of equality. But then he assumed only men were political actors. Later feminists pointed out the contradiction. If natural equality is real, it includes everyone. Both movements claimed they were being true to liberal principles, while liberals were betraying them. The disagreement wasn't about Locke's framework. It was about who counted as a rights holder within it. Liberals had assumed certain people were naturally suited for subordinate roles. Workers, women, colonized peoples. Radicals challenged these assumptions. Show us the natural difference that justifies inequality. If you can't, then equality should be real. This created a dynamic where Locke's ideas kept generating more egalitarian implications than he intended. Each generation extended rights to groups previously excluded. Each extension used the same logic. Natural rights, equality, consent. The concepts kept pushing outward. They still do. Contemporary debates about immigration, criminal justice, animal rights, and artificial intelligence often invoke rights-based arguments. Who deserves moral consideration? Who gets to participate in political decisions? What limitations on state power are legitimate? These are Lockean questions even when nobody mentions his name. The vocabulary he helped establish structures how we think about authority and freedom. That's a kind of immortality. Not because his specific answers were perfect, but because his questions remain urgent. We're still working out what natural rights mean in practice, still arguing about where consent is required, still trying to limit government power while ensuring it can function. Locke didn't solve these problems, he articulated them in ways that made productive argument possible. But there's a darker reading available. Maybe Locke's framework doesn't generate expanding circles of rights. Maybe it just provides better justifications for the same exclusions. Consider property rights again. Locke said labor creates ownership, but he also said Native Americans didn't really own their land because they hadn't enclosed and cultivated it properly. European colonists could therefore claim it legitimately. This wasn't accidental racism contradicting his principles. It was the principles themselves applied consistently. Property requires improvement. Nomadic peoples don't improve land, therefore they don't own it. You can challenge the premises. Why does ownership require European-style agriculture? Why is enclosed cultivation the only legitimate use of land? But Locke built these assumptions into his theory from the beginning. The labour theory of property wasn't neutral. It was designed to justify colonial appropriation. Similarly, with slavery, Locke condemned it as illegitimate in principle, but he invested in slave trading companies and helped write Carolina's Constitution, which protected slavery. How do you reconcile this? One option is to say he was a hypocrite who violated his own principles. Another is to notice that his principles contained loopholes. Slavery is wrong if you enslave free people. But what about prisoners of war? What about people you purchase from others who enslaved them? What about children born to enslaved parents? Locke's theory left room for these distinctions. His personal behaviour exploited that room. The same pattern appears throughout. Women lack political rights because they're naturally subordinate to husbands. Workers lack power because they've consented to employment. Colonized peoples lack sovereignty because they don't use land properly. Every exclusion gets justified within the framework, rather than contradicting it. From this perspective, Locke's theory isn't an engine of liberation that sometimes gets misapplied. It's a sophisticated defense of existing hierarchies dressed up in the language of universal rights. The genius isn't creating genuine equality, it's making inequality look legitimate. This critique has force. Locke was a man of his time defending the interests of his class. Property-owning English Protestants concerned about threats from Catholic monarchs and popular unrest. His political theory served those interests. But the critique doesn't quite work either, because people did use his ideas against him. Abolitionists quoted the Second Treatise, suffragists invoked natural rights, anti-colonial movements demanded the consent of the governed. They weren't misreading Locke, they were taking him seriously, maybe more seriously than he took himself. The framework contains genuine emancipatory potential, even if its author tried to limit that potential. Ideas exceed their origins. They can't be completely controlled by the interests that produced them. Someone articulates a principle for narrow purposes. Others notice it applies more broadly. The original author objects. Too late. The principle is loose in the world doing work nobody intended. This is why Locke matters. Not because he was a saint or a villain, not because his theory is perfect or useless, but because he helped create a language of politics that people still use to make claims against power. That language has limits and contradictions. It can justify oppression or challenge it. Which outcome occurs depends on who's speaking and what they emphasize. Locke's language of rights, property and consent wasn't just theory. It travelled. It crossed oceans, inspired revolutions, shaped constitutions. The ideas that emerged from his study in Essex became weapons in the hands of people he never imagined wielding them. And nowhere did his philosophy have more immediate and explosive impact than in the American colonies, where his words would be used to justify breaking the very empire he had helped defend. The Founding Fathers read Locke obsessively. Jefferson's library contained multiple editions of the Second Treatise. John Adams quoted him constantly. James Madison, knew the arguments by heart. When they needed philosophical justification for rebellion, they turned to the English philosopher who had explained exactly when revolution becomes legitimate. The Declaration of Independence is essentially Lockean theory, translated into revolutionary practice. Compare the language. Locke wrote that men are by nature free, equal, and independent. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. Locke said government exists to protect life, liberty, and estate. Jefferson changed estate to the pursuit of happiness, but the structure is identical. Locke argued that when government becomes tyrannical, the people retain the right to dissolve it and create a new one. Jefferson listed grievances against King George and declared the colonies free and independent states. It's almost plagiarism, except that Locke's ideas were considered common property by the 18th century. You didn't need to cite him any more than you'd cite Euclid for geometry. His political philosophy had become the default framework for English-speaking people thinking about government. The Constitution itself reflects Lockean assumptions throughout. Property rights are protected. The separation of powers prevents any single branch from becoming tyrannical. The system of checks and balances embodies Locke's distrust of concentrated authority. The Bill of Rights, added later, articulates protections that Locke would have recognized immediately: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, protection against arbitrary arrest. These are the natural rights that government exists to secure. But the American application of Locke also revealed the same contradictions that plagued his original theory. How do you proclaim that all men are created equal while holding human beings in bondage? Jefferson wrote those words. Jefferson owned slaves. Many of the men who signed the Declaration owned slaves. The Constitution itself protected slavery through multiple provisions, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, requiring the return of fugitive slaves, prohibiting Congress from banning the slave trade before 1808. The same question arises: is this hypocrisy, or is it Locke consistently applied? Both answers are partly true. Many founders recognized the contradiction. They knew that slavery violated the principles they proclaimed. Some hoped it would gradually die out. Others simply prioritized other concerns. But the Lockean framework also provided justifications. Property rights are sacred. Slaves are property. Therefore, emancipation without compensation violates the fundamental law. Women faced similar exclusion. Natural rights belong to all human beings, but women were not considered fully autonomous individuals under law. They were subsumed under their fathers or husbands. Marriage itself was a civil death for women. They could not own property, sign contracts, or vote. All of this was perfectly compatible with Lockean liberalism properly understood. The social contract was among independent household heads. Women weren't independent. Native Americans were outside the framework entirely. They hadn't mixed their labor with the land in recognizable ways. They hadn't created property. They existed in a state of nature without legitimate political authority. Therefore, their territorial claims could be dismissed and their displacement justified. These weren't bugs in the system. They were features. Locke's theory was designed to protect certain people and exclude others. It worked exactly as intended. Yet the excluded groups eventually used the theory against itself. The abolitionist movement quoted the second treatise: "If all men are by nature free, then enslaving them violates natural law. No consent justifies permanent bondage. No labor creates ownership of another human being." Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, they all invoked Locke's principles against the institution he had helped legitimize. The women's suffrage movement did the same. Mary Wollstonecraft argued that women possess reason just as men do. Therefore, they possess natural rights. Their exclusion from political life contradicts the fundamental logic of liberal government. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, read at Seneca Falls in 1848, deliberately echoed Jefferson's declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. The addition of 3 words transformed the meaning. Anti-colonial movements followed the pattern. If government requires the consent of the governed, then colonial rule without representation is tyranny. The American revolutionaries had made this argument against Britain. Indians used it against Britain a century and a half later. African independence movements used it in the 20th century. Ho Chi Minh quoted Jefferson in Vietnam's Declaration of Independence. Every time, the response was the same. You're misapplying the principles. These rights don't extend to your situation. You're not ready for self-government. You lack the civilization, the rationality, the development that makes autonomy possible. But eventually, the exclusions became impossible to defend. Not because people suddenly became more enlightened, because the excluded groups organized, demanded recognition, and forced confrontation with the contradiction between universal principles and particular exclusions. Locke's theory was a tool. Like any tool, it could be used for different purposes. But it wasn't neutral. It was designed with specific purposes in mind. The fact that it could be repurposed doesn't erase the original design. It just means ideas are slippery. They escape their creators. This brings us to the deepest question about Locke's legacy. Was he ultimately a force for liberation or for oppression? The answer depends on what timeline you examine. In his own lifetime, Locke's political philosophy defended the interests of the English merchant and landowning classes. It justified revolution against one kind of tyranny while protecting against more radical challenges to property and hierarchy. It opened space for religious toleration, but only within Protestant Christianity. It proclaimed universal rights while building in exclusions that left most of humanity outside the circle of full citizenship. Over the following centuries, those who had been excluded used Locke's language to fight their way inside the circle. The universalist rhetoric created pressure that the exclusions couldn't permanently withstand. If rights are truly natural, if they truly belong to all human beings, then you can't indefinitely deny them to most human beings without the justification collapsing. The struggle continues. We still argue about property rights, about the limits of government authority, about who counts as a full citizen. We still debate consent, representation, and the conditions under which revolution becomes legitimate. We're still working through questions Locke framed 3.5 centuries ago. His personal investments in slavery, his justifications for colonialism, his exclusion of women, all of this matters. It shows how emancipatory language can coexist with oppressive practice. It reveals the class interests embedded in supposedly neutral theory. It warns us to examine who benefits when universal principles get articulated with convenient exceptions. But the fact that people later used his ideas against those exclusions also matters. It shows that philosophical frameworks can't be completely controlled by their creators, that principles, once articulated, take on lives of their own, that the language of rights, however compromised at its origin, became a resource for movements that Locke would have opposed. Both things are true simultaneously. Locke's theory enabled oppression and resistance. It justified hierarchy and challenged it. It created the modern world with all its freedoms and all its continuing injustices. The contradictions aren't resolved. They're still active, still productive of political struggle. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not a set of timeless truths, but a framework for ongoing argument. A language that lets us fight about power, property, and freedom in terms that everyone claims to accept, even when we disagree about what those terms actually mean. Locke thought he was defending a particular political settlement in 17th century England. Instead, he helped create the vocabulary of modern politics. 3 centuries later, we're still speaking his language, still arguing his arguments, still trying to figure out whether the rights he proclaimed can ever be reconciled with the exclusions he endorsed. The question remains open because Locke left it open. His theory contains the materials for its own critique. You can use Locke against Locke. People have been doing it for generations. That tension between universal principles and particular exclusions, between the promise of natural rights and the reality of systematic inequality, that's not a problem to be solved. It's the engine of political change. As long as we believe in rights, we'll argue about who has them. As long as we believe in consent, we'll fight about whose consent counts. As long as we believe government should serve the people, we'll struggle over who the people are. Locke didn't resolve these questions. He gave us a way to fight about them. And we've been fighting ever since. His shadow falls across American courtrooms, where judges interpret constitutional rights. Across international tribunals, where human rights claims are adjudicated. Across political movements demanding recognition and redistribution. The language changes, the arguments evolve, but the basic framework remains recognizably Lockean. Beyond politics, Locke's philosophical influence extends into domains he barely considered. His theory of the mind shaped psychology for 2 centuries. His epistemology influenced the development of empirical science. His writings on education affected how Western societies think about child development. The man who spent his life in political exile and philosophical obscurity became, after his death, one of the architects of modernity. The empiricism he defended became the foundation of the scientific method. The idea that knowledge comes from experience, tested and refined, led directly to the experimental approach that transformed human understanding of the natural world. When scientists insist on evidence, when they reject claims unsupported by observation, they're working in a tradition Locke helped establish. His educational theory, laid out in Some Thoughts Concerning Education, emphasized the importance of reason over rote memorization. Children should be taught to think, not merely to obey. Learning should be pleasant, adapted to the child's developing capacities. These ideas seem obvious now. They were radical in 1693. The modern progressive education movement, with all its strengths and weaknesses, traces its ancestry partly to Locke. Even his economic ideas had lasting impact. The labour theory of value, the notion that human work creates economic worth, influenced Adam Smith, and through Smith, the entire classical economics tradition. Karl Marx would later transform it into the labour theory of exploitation. But both were building on foundations Locke had laid. The puzzle of John Locke is that he was simultaneously visionary and reactionary, liberating and oppressive, universal and parochial. He proclaimed principles that exceeded his own understanding of their implications. He built a philosophy of freedom that left most people unfree. He created tools that others would use to dismantle the very structures he defended. Was he a hypocrite? Certainly sometimes. Was he simply a man of his time? Partly, but that doesn't explain why his ideas outlasted their moment. Was he a radical whose insights were genuine despite his blindness? Also partly true. The complete answer is that he was all of these things at once. Contradictory, brilliant, limited, and transformative. 320 years after his death, we're still living in the world John Locke helped create. A world of rights and markets, of constitutional government and religious toleration, of empirical science and individual liberty. But also a world of persistent inequality, of economic exploitation justified as voluntary exchange, of exclusions rationalized through philosophical argument. We can't escape Locke any more than we can escape the air we breathe. His concepts structure how we think about politics, even when we've never read a word he wrote. Property, consent, rights, government, freedom. These words carry meanings shaped by his arguments. When we use them, we're thinking in Lockean categories, whether we know it or not. The task isn't to accept or reject Locke wholesale. It's to understand what his framework enables and what it forecloses, what questions it lets us ask and what questions it makes invisible, what forms of life it protects and what forms it abandons. His philosophy gave us the language to challenge kings, but it also gave kings the language to defend themselves. It helped create democracy. It also helped create capitalism with all its creative power and destructive force. It proclaimed human equality. It also rationalized systematic inequality. The house in High Laver, where Locke died, no longer stands. The village remains quiet and unremarkable, unaware that it sheltered one of history's most consequential minds in his final years. There's no grand monument, no pilgrimage site, nothing to mark the spot where the philosopher who helped invent the modern world took his last breath. Perhaps that's fitting. Locke always insisted that ideas mattered more than their authors, that truth was discovered through observation and argument, not revealed through authority, that what a person claimed should be judged by evidence and reason, not by who made the claim. He would have hated the idea of his grave becoming a shrine. He spent his life arguing against the worship of dead authorities. But the absence of monuments doesn't mean absence of influence. Walk through any modern democracy, and you're walking through institutions Locke helped conceptualize. Read any constitution protecting individual rights, and you're reading ideas Locke articulated. Participate in any free market economy, and you're operating within a framework Locke defended. The 20th century brought new challenges to Lockean principles. Totalitarian movements on both left and right explicitly rejected the individualism at the heart of his philosophy. Fascists proclaimed the primacy of the state. Communists proclaimed the primacy of the collective. Both dismissed natural rights as bourgeois fiction. Yet liberal democracy, however imperfectly realized, survived these challenges. The post-war order, with all its flaws, was built on foundations recognizably Lockean. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, speaks a language Locke would have understood. Life, liberty, property, consent. The vocabulary is his even when the applications extend beyond anything he imagined. The civil rights movements of the 20th century used Lockean language to challenge Lockean limitations. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of inalienable rights, when he invoked the promissory note of equality written into America's founding documents, he was holding the nation accountable to principles it claimed but failed to honor. The same philosophical framework that had excluded him was now the weapon demanding his inclusion. This is the strange power of universalist principles. Once proclaimed, they develop a logic independent of their author's intentions. Locke said all men are created equal while accepting slavery. But that statement, once made, couldn't be contained. Others would take it seriously, even if he didn't. They would ask why equality stopped at race, at gender, at property ownership. They would use his own arguments against the exclusions he defended. The feminist movement did this with particular force. Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792 had already pointed out that if reason is the basis of human equality and women possess reason, then women must be equal. Locke's framework contained the seeds of its own expansion. Every subsequent wave of feminism returned to this fundamental insight, demanding that liberal principles be applied consistently. Post-colonial thinkers would do the same. If consent is required for legitimate government, then colonial rule without consent is tyranny. If property rights are sacred, then colonial extraction is theft. The philosophical tools that European powers used to justify their domination became, in other hands, tools for dismantling that domination. This creates an odd historical pattern. Locke's philosophy has been both conservative and revolutionary, depending on who wielded it and when. It justified existing power structures. It also provided the language for challenging them. It rationalized exclusion. It also demanded inclusion. The question is whether this flexibility is a strength or a weakness. Does it mean Lockean liberalism is fundamentally sound, capable of self-correction and progressive expansion? Or does it mean the philosophy is so vague that it can justify anything, its apparent universality masking persistent biases? Contemporary political philosophy remains divided on this question. Some defenders argue that Locke's core insights remain valid even where his applications were wrong. The method is sound. The conclusions can be corrected. Others argue that the problems run deeper, that the entire framework is compromised by its origins in a particular historical moment with particular exclusions. The debate about property is especially sharp. Locke's labour theory seemed straightforward enough in the 17th century. Mix your labour with unowned resources and they become yours. But what counts as unowned? What happens when all resources are already claimed? What about resources that require collective effort rather than individual labour? What about intellectual property, digital goods, genetic information? Modern economies bear little resemblance to the world Locke described. Most people don't own the product of their labour. They sell their labour to others who own the means of production. The factory worker doesn't own the car. The programmer doesn't own the software. The researcher doesn't own the patent. Is this consistent with Locke's principles, or a violation of them? Libertarians invoke Locke to defend property rights against taxation and regulation. Socialists invoke Locke to argue that contemporary property arrangements are illegitimate because they violate the requirement that acquisition leave enough and as good for others. Both claim his authority. Both can cite passages supporting their position. The debate about consent faces similar complications. If legitimate government requires consent, what form must that consent take? Is it enough to have ancestors who consented? Must each generation consent anew? Can silence count as consent? What about people who explicitly dissent but remain subject to laws they oppose? These questions matter because they shape real political conflicts. Immigration policy, taxation, regulation, the legitimacy of international institutions. All involve competing interpretations of what consent requires and what it permits. Locke provided the questions. He didn't provide final answers. Perhaps he couldn't have. The application of general principles to specific circumstances requires judgment that varies with context. But that means his philosophy is more like a grammar than a dictionary. It gives us rules for constructing arguments. It doesn't give us ready-made conclusions. The empiricist epistemology faces challenges too. Locke insisted all knowledge comes from experience, but 20th century philosophy of science showed that observation is theory-laden. We don't simply receive sensory impressions neutrally. We interpret them through conceptual frameworks we already possess. There's no purely empirical foundation, no uninterpreted given. This doesn't make science impossible. It makes it different from what Locke imagined. Knowledge isn't built from simple ideas upward, like a pyramid on a foundation. It's more like a web where beliefs support each other mutually, revised and adjusted as new evidence comes in, but never reduced to a single, unshakable base. Yet Locke's basic, empiricist impulse remains sound. Whatever the complexities of observation, experience still constrains belief. We can't simply make up facts about the world. Evidence matters. Testing matters. The experimental method that Locke championed, however philosophically complex its foundations, continues to generate reliable knowledge. The religious toleration Locke defended has become the default position in liberal democracies, though he would barely recognize its modern form. He argued for toleration within Christianity, plus perhaps Judaism. Contemporary pluralism extends far beyond that. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, atheists, all are included in the civic sphere that Locke helped theorize but wouldn't have fully accepted. The exclusion of atheists from toleration looks particularly strange now. Locke thought oaths and contracts required divine sanction. Without belief in God, he argued, promises meant nothing, and social trust collapsed. Secular societies have proven him wrong. Social cooperation doesn't require shared religious belief. Morality doesn't depend on divine command. These were Locke's blind spots, places where his philosophy failed to live up to its own principles. But here's the remarkable thing. The framework survived the corrections. Liberal toleration expanded to include the people Locke excluded without abandoning the basic argument for toleration itself.